everybody, good to be here with you all. My name is Jordan. I'm a product manager on the .NET team, focused around helping you build out solutions with .NET where you use AI in your apps. And today I am your tour guide through the world of AI models. So we're going to spend a little time together here, and I'll take you through and talk a bit about some of the different models available to you, how you can work with them both through hosted services, third-party services, locally, as well as in Azure. So first up, there are thousands of models these days that are available to you. You've seen us use some of these in the different sessions over the past few days. We've got models from Microsoft with the 5 family of models. You've got the Meta Ollama models and Mistral, and then of course, OpenAI. And it can be a little confusing sometimes to figure, where do I start? Where do I begin? Where do I go? Well, first, what I like to start with is actually even start with a model like OpenAI that's very capable. It's able to do a lot of different things to even suss out, start prototyping and exploring my ideas, seeing if they're even feasible. And then from there, once I've got the initial idea going, start poking around and playing with different models. So in this session, I want to take you through and kind of introduce you to ways in .NET working with the Microsoft Extensions AI library, how you can kind of just dive in here and start playing around. So first up, let's go with how we would start exploring and looking at these models. Recently announced at GitHub Universe was the GitHub models. It was in sort of a limited preview. Now it's available to everybody working with a GitHub account. Making it available to you to go ahead and play around with models, start exploring on your own. So this is available if you've got a GitHub account. You set up a personal access token, and then you can start working with these. So for example, here I'm in the marketplace for GitHub models, and I can navigate here and see what are different models available to me. I could explore, what are some of the scenarios these support, like multimodal scenarios, multilingual. So this is one nice place to look around, start exploring, seeing what's out there. Luis is on right before me, and he has this great phrase about exploring the art of the possible. These are really nice ways to look at what is even possible with AI? What can I play around with? And so to help you out with that, we could dive in, and there's a playground experience, as well as this kind of first intro screen here that lets you get an overview of what the models are, what they're capable of. So for example, we'll start with GPT-4o, and we'll switch over into the playground. And here I can start right away chatting with the model and exploring, changing some of these settings, like the temperature, which basically dictates the creativity of the model. You can also go right away, look at the code view, and here I've set it to C#, and I can, for example, see some examples of working with this model through, in this case, the Azure Inference SDK. We'll come around back in a moment on some code on how to call these models. First, as far as a way of early experimenting and playing with a playground, it's a nice spot to start exploring some initial ideas. So, for example, one thing I was looking at building out was a music chatbot. I like to call it BeatBot, playing off of the MVC music sample you might have seen way back in the past with .NET. And I wrote a system prompt that we'll go through here real quick. I'll zoom that in for you, which basically I'm instructing this, the system prompt, by the way, being what tells this assistant, you're in this kind of a way of responding to things. This is your persona. So I'm saying that you're a helpful music expert who even likes the deep cuts. And you always bring any subject back to music, and trying this idea out of how might I see some citations around the sources that it references. So taking this, we'll copy it, paste it into the system prompt, and I can do a quick test of this to see that it works and say, what was the top album in, we'll say 1998, because that's when I actually started out in the software business. And we'll get back here in a moment, a response. And it should be hopefully something close in the realm of music, right? Sure enough, this comes back and it tells us Britney Spears song that was in the top. And as you look through here, there are links to these citations that let us see about where the info came from. Now, if I try to go off script, it'll also take it back to music. So what about the top movie? Now we can go ahead and compare a couple. I clicked the button that said compare, brought up the second screen. And now I could look and say, let's pick another model. We'll go with Mistral large. Let me clear out what I said over here. And now I can ask the same question of both models. We'll say this time what was a top album in 2002. And this will show me the comparison between what the GPT-4o model says versus the Mistral large model. And you'll see some variances in the way they respond. Maybe there's some different data based on how they were trained. What this does too is this will maintain and synchronize my settings between the two windows. So I have the same system prompt, same temperature, and it gives me a side-by-side comparison. So it's kind of a fun way to explore these models and start to dive in, see what you can do. Now let's take this back to some actual working code. And what I have here, this is a sample application. We'll go ahead and run this, and I'll talk about it for a second. This is a sample. I've got a link to at the end for you to check out. That lets us chat and as well as play with an image. And so Blazor application, I can ask a question. Describe this image to me and write a 2-paragraph story based upon it. And I can upload an image. In this case, a picture of a frog I took from my garden. See a little frog on a leaf, and we see what happens. So this is going against GitHub models. Right now, I'm using the GPT-4o mini model in this case. And you see here we get our response back. And this has my citation was in it. I used the same system prompt we were just playing with. And I've got a description up at the top of what it sees, which usually what's fun in these is they call out not just there's a frog, but there's a leaf. In this case, they, I think, got it right that this is on some cabbage. And oftentimes there's even a mention of like a droplet of water that's sitting on there. And so now I can kind of just start to play around from here. But I took a prompt I was experimenting with in GitHub Models Playground, brought it into this image app, and start playing, see what happens. So if I come back in here, a few details on this sample. This project is set up to run with different hosts. So in this case, I used GitHub, and I could change up the model. I could work with Ollama 3.2, 11b, Vision Instruct. It's another one that I've worked with, kind of playing around here. And in my app, what's setting up the code to run here, I'm using the Microsoft.extensions AI library. And the real thing in this app, there's this method that's configuring where we pull the models from. But this is the only thing that's changing in the code. So here we started with my fallback, which is GitHub models. I'm able to get whatever details I need to connect, like the model ID endpoint to connect to and a key. Oops, sorry for all the pop-ups there. OK. And the key thing is, as long as we can get an iChat client like you see here, and we add that in, I can go ahead and use Microsoft Extensions AI to write my application, and I can then swap through the other models we're about to look at, like Azure OpenAI. It's just a slightly different endpoint and that we go through, but as long as I can get that chat client, the rest of my code can stay the same, and I can play against different sources for models, play against the different models those sources offer. All the time, this same code here, this is my chat service in the app that has the core of the logic. Here's our system prompt. None of this changes. So I can swap out models, play around using the same source code as I experiment. So that was a real quick overview with GitHub models and some of the models we could access there. We'll come back to that in a moment about where you would go from there, like say if you want to start going toward more complex applications or things that start to push on the limits or go toward production. But another great place when you're starting to play around is in local models. And as .NET devs, we get kind of used to doing this. We've been doing things like local SQL databases for years. And it's a natural starting point to think of working with a local model, something I can do local on my machine. There's no credit card being billed, no anything else, just experimenting locally. And let's take a look. That's something you can do with .NET. There are some caveats, though, which is usually around the compute power required. So if you look at running these models, a small language model, we would call those that typically can run on your hardware. Even those can have pretty hefty constraints around the memory requirements and GPUs on your local machines. But as long as you've got those, you can use a small language model. They're a really great alternative. They can be very focused on specific tasks, be very good at those, lower compute, very efficient. And then you've got the large language models like we started off with, OpenAI, Mistral large, that are really good multi-purpose models. They may have higher compute. You definitely can't run these on your local machine typically unless you got a really beefy setup. But let's see how we could use one of these small language models with a .NET solution here. So for this, I'm using a product called Ollama. You've seen, maybe even heard mention of this in some of the sessions. We've used it for a few of the demos. And what Ollama does is it's an app that can run locally on your machine, runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it can bring down models locally. It allows you to access those through a REST API that they expose. And so when you use Ollama, you've got a large selection of models we can work with on here. So this is just from their website. You can see some of these here that I could be working with. And in my case, in my environment, we've got Ollama already running, and I've got a few models that I've already brought down. So in this case, let's say I want to play with Llama 3.2 for a moment. And just in their console app with Ollama, I can actually run some quick questions past the language model and try them out. And so it's got a nice command line interface for bringing down models, serving them up, running with them. This is taking just a moment to load, but if I'd been doing this without the model installed already, it would be downloading it and take even longer. But here I'm in, I can ask a quick question. What color is a frog? Because I suddenly lost my creative spark for prompts. And there you go. I'm interacting with the model and I can start also playing around maybe with a little mini playground right here from the console. But I think this definitely gets more interesting when we layer in our app, right? So let's jump over, and I'll just swap the configuration of this project to run with a local model. Now, what's happening here, the way this project is configured, is we are using the Lava 7B model because this has some ability to work with images. So that's what I'm set up to use with Ollama now. We'll go back to our project here. Same thing we did before, describe this image and write a short 2-paragraph story about it. And then let's see what it does with our friendly little frog again. Now this will take a moment. I am on a machine that's got some pretty good specs, but it still takes a moment to run. If we take a look at my GPU as this is going, we can prove to ourselves that something's happening. And usually that gets up close to, yeah, here we go, 20, 40%. So we're going to start seeing the content in this SAML streaming in. I haven't figured out why it starts out with continued from above, but we still get a description here of a small green frog. This kind of jumped right into writing a story, but this has details based on the background, the colors. It's in a garden on a broccoli plant. Remember, all I said was describe the image and write a story. And so there, now we're running off of a local model. So if this were on my local laptop that was hefty enough, I could be disconnected from a network, even on a plane flight and playing around with AI. Click that up. And again, the connection here with Microsoft Extensions AI, Ollama is another one of those providers that you can plug in. And in this case here, I'm able to create an Ollama chat client, and then I pass it in and configure my app to work with it, and then all the rest of the Microsoft Extensions AI code works to be able to do my image processing. So real quick, we just looked at one small language, a few more details about small language models versus the larger language models. The small language models, they're typically, they're fewer parameters, they are less intense on your computer, so the compute requirements aren't as hefty as a large language model. And they can also work in lower compute, lower energy scenarios, which is a nice thing. They can be very good at specific use cases, specific tasks. So in some cases, it may be nicer to use a small language model tailored for text classification than, say, using a bigger general purpose model. Conversely, you look at the large language models, they have a higher number of parameters, have a higher compute requirement, so they probably won't work on your hardware. But they also, because of that, are very good at general tasks. They can do more complex scenarios and more of them. They can handle a wider range of languages, and they naturally also have the higher compute costs, higher energy costs to them. So there's always that trade-off. Both options are available to you with .NET. We just looked at, in both these samples so far, running a couple of these here. Okay, so let's bring it on here. We'll jump over and mention the cloud in the mix here. So what we started with first was working with GitHub models. I was experimenting locally using GPT-4o Mini. I could have played with some other vision models. At some point in time, you're going to want to be able to more operationalize that and take it to either take it to the cloud, or maybe your requirements got more complex. So you need something more than the defaults that are set up with GitHub models. And that's where we get into, where do we go next? So Azure AI Model Catalog is actually what powers this is the same as what's powering GitHub models behind the scenes. So if you've got a model you're working with in GitHub models, you can also use that from the Azure AI Model Catalog. Likewise, if I'm working with a local model during my app development and I'm working toward production with my app, many of the models you would work with locally are also available in the AI Model Catalog, and that would be another option you'd bring up when you go into those maybe production systems. So I'm not going to take the time and run this specific demo, but the code would be about the same in this exact sample. If I wanted to run against the Azure AI Model Catalog, I would change what this endpoint is, and I'd have to set up either, ideally you access with your Azure credentials, so Entra ID authentication. You could use a key during, while you're playing around as well. Just make sure you keep that secure. But it would just be those couple changes, and the same code we were running would work for this because the GitHub models is already working with the same inference SDK used for Azure in this case. So let's take a look real quick at the Azure AI Model Catalog. And you can see here, this is a little similar to like with the GitHub models we were playing with. In Azure AI Studio, I can take a look at the model catalog, and I have an experience in here to explore the models available to me. I have some nice helpers with the filters that also are really good thought starters here for what are scenarios, what are things I could do with AI. Text classification, token classification, chat, of course, summarization. So there's some nice little extra exploration stuff in here. I could take any of these and actually here, we're going to go over to one that I've deployed. I've got a deployment already set up. So in a playground experience, I can do something similar to what we just did a moment ago in GitHub models, where I can add up my own system prompt, explore from within Azure, manage my infra, and set up from here. So one other benefit to this, when we're looking at, say, the local models where we're working with Ollama, one question that comes up typically would be like, well, can I just use Ollama in production as well? Can I just take the small language models I was using? Why not use Ollama? You could set up a container you deploy with Ollama in it. You could use those in production. A trade-off there is like, do you want to manage the infra yourself and some of the maintenance of that, versus perhaps a solution like the AI Model Catalog, maybe one that takes care of some of those for you, layers in with your infra better. It just depends on your environment, what works best for you. So now we'll come into the wrap-up of a few last points to consider in here that I want to leave you with. First, there's one of like choosing the right model. We've touched on this a bit as we've been going through. A few things to think about as you look at models. Again, we go back to the beginning. I love to start with something maybe that's more than I need, like GPT-4o, depending on my scenarios, just to see what's possible. And then as I go by and evaluate, do I want to stick with that or something else? I got to think of questions like, what are the use cases I've got? How complex are they? That would help me discover, like, do I want to use a more specific model? If I have requirements for a diversity of languages, that may impact like which models I want to work with. Do they support my target languages for input, output? Availability of resources, what are your constraints around budget for things like the cost? If you get into the world later down the line of things like fine-tuning, how does it support that? Then deployment environments too, about the regionally, does this support where I want the model to go with the host I work with? Does it support the regions I need to support? And in performance, there's both the ones we think of a lot like latency and those kinds of responses, but also I would lump in here the things like responsible AI and quality of your responses. So one other thing you can look at after this session, there's the Microsoft Extensions AI evaluation work that's in library that's in preview. We talked about it in a talk just yesterday. With the evaluation library, you can set up a set of, think of Q&A tests to validate that the quality, the answers you get out are hitting your quality metrics for your solution based on the kinds of questions that may get asked. And you can build up this inventory over time of this evaluation set of questions and answers. And that is super valuable to then also let you experiment changing out different models in the system. And if you're backed with the Q&A data, the evaluations to help you out, you can know more soundly as you change and try out different models, how does it impact the end result? Does the quality bar stay where I need it? And so really, I think the way you would go about this is going to be something more like in your own flow. You'd start first with the question of, can AI solve my use case? Prototype. Play around, see for yourself if your ideas are possible and can it work out. Then from there, you're going to get into what's the best model to use. This is where you experiment with techniques we've talked about, like prompt engineering, retrieval augmented generation, helping you chat with your own data, maybe trying out different models. This would be the phase where you're optimizing the solution. And then eventually you'll also get towards scaling to what you need in the real world. And this gets out toward other details of the, how do you support load balancing across these and capacity constraints and all those that might be upon you. So with that, that's kind of wrapping up the main talk we've gone through. We've covered a lot of ground in a quick almost 30 minutes, going from local models to hosted models, played around with images in the chat as well. Here's some links to leave you with that'll let you go check out the image sample we were using. A great video analysis sample that Bruno, who'll be back on screen in just a moment, has been building out that also lets you try out models from different sources, working with different libraries. And then we've got some AI app samples to check out that help you with some sort of quick starts to get up and running, playing around with AI. And then our AI docs are always there to help you out as well in .NET.